What a great honor to be here on the territories of the Huron and of the Seneca, and most recently of the Mississauga of New Credit, and most especially on your special day, graduates. Congratulations. I can see the love your families have for you and your friends. They come here with huge smiles, lots of cameras, with flowers and a few teddy bears. And I want you to take that love that you feel here today into everything you do. Love and courage are the two essential ingredients to defeating darkness and defeating hate. That love that has been gifted to you and modeled to you by your friends, by your family, and by those who have gone before you is your greatest source of strength in the years ahead. You've been gifted with knowledge from the University of Toronto, and now you must give it away generously, but with that love and with that courage. And this means you need to have the moral courage to stand up when others tell you to sit down. It means you need to have the moral courage to speak up when others want you to be silent. It means you need to step forward when others want you to be a bystander. And it means you need to stand with the whistleblowers and the morally courageous people of our time so that they are not alone. The morality of the world's leaders means that we have weak leadership knees at the moment. So it's up to us, the people, as it has always been up to us, the people, to lift up humanity so that we can live with dignity. Everyone can live with dignity no matter where they are in the world. As the poem says, they'll be trembling in their palaces as we are singing in the prisons. Or, to put a more contemporary spin on it, they'll be trembling in the White House as we are singing at the borders for the children who should never be separated from their families. Canada's troubling history of separating First Nations children, Métis children, and Inuit children have taught us that. It's not enough to say we're sorry. We have to learn from the past. We have to look for examples of people who have been morally courageous. I have been so blessed to know Shannon Kustachin, a First Nations teen girl who spent her whole life fighting for safe and proper schools because, as she said, she wanted to grow up and be someone important. And you can't do that when you're getting half of the education funding as everybody else. I have been inspired by Jordan River Anderson, a little baby boy who died after spending 2 years unnecessarily in a hospital because Canada and Manitoba argued over who should pay for his at-home services because he was First Nations. And I have been inspired by Ella, who's sitting in the front row is my special guest today, who, when we filed the human rights complaint and had all of our funding cut, I got a beautiful drawing in the mail. And it said, "Dear Cindy, here's some MUNY for the kids. Love, Ella." And inside was the change, and I still have that today, Ella. And Ella has been a cheerleader for justice since the very beginning. I've also been inspired by some of the people on this stage, like Cheryl Reger, who put up with me as my PhD supervisor. And Barbara Fallon, a deep friend who combines both love and research. Bob Ray, who tries to teach me about politics, and I'm not sure I can do that in one lifetime. I think I might have to come back for a new one. And our friends at OISE and the School of Medicine. But children are particularly good teachers. They're both most courageous and most loving. And so when children understand that First Nations kids still get less public funding than other people, they don't just wring their hands in disbelief. They do as many courageous people are doing on the US border today. They are standing up, they are speaking, and they are demanding a better country. They are asking that we as adults actually live up to the aspirations that we value the most, not just as a country of Canada, but as a human being, as a human family. I've learned a lot from our ancestors too, and one of the ancestors that I would like to honor today is a man named Peter Henderson Bryce. He graduated from the University of Toronto when Canada was only 9 years old. He became Canada's first public health officer. And he wrote the first health code for Ontario that's managed to spread its way all throughout the Americas. He was also the president of the American Public Health Association and considered to be one of the top experts on infectious disease. He's credited with saving at least 15,000 lives by stopping an infectious train from coming all the way from Montreal and spreading its way west to Ottawa and Toronto. And for those reasons alone, he should be remembered. But he's forgotten because of what he did at the age of 51. He took up a post at the Department of Indian Affairs as Chief Medical Health Officer, and he surveyed the health of the kids in the schools. He found they were dying at a rate of 24% a year. And if you tracked them over 3 years, it was 48%. Most shocking of all, Bryce said, the amount of health care funding provided to the City of Ottawa exceeded that provided to all First Nations people across the country by a factor of 3. He comes back to the Canadian government, he says, medical science knows just what to do. Even out the funding, provide these kids with proper nutrition, to stop putting sick kids in with healthy kids, and we could save their lives. And what did the Canadian government do? Say, that would cost us $15,000, and our budget of $100 million cannot absorb that. So we're saying no. And what did Dr. Bryce do? Well, somehow his report ended up on the front page of many of the newspapers across Canada. Now, no one knows exactly who did it, but the Canadian government at least suspected Dr. Bryce. So they began persecuting him. They cut all of his research funding. They blocked his presentations at conferences, and they began to try and disparage him. And the man who said no is a man named Duncan Campbell Scott. Some of you may remember him from your English literature classes. He was a Confederate poet, but his day job for 52 years was being the person who headed up the residential school file at the Department of Indian Affairs. But Bryce would not be silenced. He knew it wasn't enough to speak up once for these kids. You had to keep talking, even if you thought no one else was listening, because one day he hoped someone would. And he believed something else. He thought we, the people of the period, when we found out about these misgivings, we would stand up as the people on the border with the United States is doing right now, and they would stand up for justice. They would stand up for humanity. They would stand up for dignity. And some did, including another UT graduate from the law school, Samuel Hume Blake, who said that in that Canada failed to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brought itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. Dr. Bryce was pushed out of the public service in 1922, but he used it as an opportunity to publish another pamphlet called A National Crime. He circulated it even more broadly than his 1907 report. That same year, Duncan Campbell Scott was here at the University of Toronto receiving an honorary doctorate. And he was also president of the Royal Society of Canada, Canada's highest academic organization. Dr. Bryce dies in obscurity in 1932, and, well, Duncan Campbell Scott, he got a huge reception. He was put on the list of persons of significance by the Canadian government, and he was taught in high school English classes where I first met him. And I have to say, I thought his poetry sucked back then, and I didn't know what his day job was. Well, that's the way things were for many years, but you know the story about justice and dignity and the right finally winning in the end. You see, the day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for the wrongs of residential school, I found myself in Beechwood Cemetery with a bouquet of brightly colored flowers representing all the children that Dr. Bryce had to save. I went there to thank him. And as I was walking through the National Cemetery, I saw all these tall monuments. You've seen those, right? I'm a girl from the bush in northern BC, and I could never figure out why people build those things. Finally, an elder told me. He said, it's to weigh them down. And that made sense. So I found Dr. Bryce in a small valley, and there he was with a modest headstone. I thanked him for everything that he tried to do. And I laid the flowers down, and I told him about a case that we had filed against the Canadian government 100 years to the day after he had actually filed his report in the Evening Citizen. I promised him I would be back when the kids won. It took me 9 years to fulfill that promise, but in January of 2016, I got my gumboots on, I walked down the snowy hill, And there, under a blue sky, I read Dr. Bryce the decision. Alone in the cemetery with one trail of footsteps. But as I looked at those one trail of footsteps, I knew that they were trodden by many others, by the moms and dads who tried to keep those kids safe and keep them at home, by the grandparents who prayed for them, by the people like Dr. Bryce, who throughout the entire history of residential schools had raised the alarm, and by many of you who wish you were there at the time and you could have done something to help them feel better. And so a few years after that, we work with the Bryce family, and we've now put a historical plaque beside Dr. Bryce's grave that recognizes this great man, and he's being taught in elementary schools. So you can walk into an elementary school and see him on your wall of heroes. There is a health center here at the University of Toronto recognizing Dr. Bryce. And what of Duncan Campbell Scott, the man who didn't have the moral courage, who got rewarded for being a moral coward? Well, thanks to the courageous survivors of residential school and the work of historians, he's properly remembered now as a Confederate poet. But he's also had a revision to his plaque of burial at Beechwood Cemetery. See, he happens to be buried just over the hill from Dr. Bryce. So his plaque now says Confederate poet and cultural genocide on the same plaque. And, oh, one more thing. Duncan Campbell Scott's office still stands in Ottawa. And have you ever been in a house which you really loved and had to move on and you wondered what the next people would be like? Well, it was about 60 years later, after Duncan Campbell Scott moved out, that the Aboriginal People's Television Network moved in. And it became their first Ottawa bureau. Bryce and Scott teach us a lot of things. They teach us that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't get supported or rewarded. It reminds us of the importance of all of us to have moral courage to do right, even if we're going to take a hit for it, and to stand by our friends who have the courage to do so. It also tells us that we should not ever reward moral cowardice. And at this particular period of time when we need to give life to human values, it's going to take every bit of our courage and every bit of glitter from children and every bit of the love that you've been given to defeat that darkness, but we will defeat it. We will defeat it. And it also teaches us, the people of the period, not to be that bystander. We can't stand by while the humanity faces one of its greatest challenges. We must be singing on the borders while they tremble in the palaces. And we need people just like you, like every one of you graduates. You may not feel ready to be courageous or worthy of being courageous, but you are humanity's best chance. And if you ever need a little bit of courage, just look up to the sky and remember your ancestors. Because your ancestors, every one of them, were courageous. They stood in the face and the winds of discrimination, in the winds of harm, in the winds of hatred, so that you could be here today. And I can see from each one of your faces, and those of your family, that their sacrifice was worth it. So President, Chancellor, it is a great honor to be here. And I have to tell you one other secret, that getting the PhD is actually easier than the honorary graduate, because I had to try and behave for my entire life to get this, or at least not be caught misbehaving as much as I was. So for that, warmest congratulations.